Good morning, everyone. That's pretty loud. See if it's a little bit better there. Yep. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Week number 10. So this is going to be the last week in which you're going to have a proper tutorial before or after this. Starting next week, you will be doing presentations of your second part of the assignment. Exciting. So this week's lecture is on credit judgment. So what we will do today is we're going to look at the firm from an outside perspective. Many of the things we've been doing in previous weeks was to look at the firm and making forecasts and trying to value the firm. And that could either be done from an internal perspective or also as a financial analyst outside the firm. What we will look at today is how financial institutions and other creditors look at the firm and decide whether they are willing to lend money to the firm or not, and what are the bases in which they make these decisions. So we will have a brief look at the market for credit. We'll have another overview of the credit analysis process, and then look at private and public debt. Those are the main things we're going to be doing, together with looking at models to predict distress, models that will tell creditors whether the firm is likely to enter into financial distress or not. So this is the to-do list for this week. Understanding the market for credit, looking at credit analysis, understanding public debt, looking at prediction of distress. We're going to focus on one model, which is Altman's SET score, more than anything. And more than anything, and this is what I think is the biggest takeaway from this lecture, is putting on the shoes of someone lending money to a company and what sort of things they look into and how they make their decisions. So, who has to make a credit decision? Well, here's a list of potential people or agents who will care about these kind of decisions. Potential suppliers, to make sure that the company can actually repay what they're buying. Commercial bankers who are lending money to the firm. Pension funds, insurance companies, or other investors. The borrower itself, and also auditors, employees, customers, and competitors. So there's a wide range of agents interested in knowing how the credit decisions are made with a particular firm. When we look at who provides credit to firms, we're grouping these into 4 categories. We're looking at commercial banks, which provide private debt. And the reason for calling that private debt is because this is debt that is not provided via the capital markets, but on a private transaction between the lender, the bank, and the borrower, the firm. There's other private lenders. There are non-banks. We will focus on them as well. Then we have public debt markets, which are a completely different source of credit for firms. And finally, trade credits. Out of those 4 sources, I would separate the first 3 from the last one. And the main reason for doing that is The first three are purely financial. So these are creditors that are committing funds and providing funds to the firm and expecting an explicit interest rate, right? So they're financial instruments. Whereas trade credit is usually provided by suppliers. And if that's the case, this kind of debt is more on the operating side of the firm than the financing side of the firm. So let's get into each of these four categories. Commercial banks, what sort of advantages do they have? Well, they basically sit very closely, they have a relationship with the firm, so that's definitely an advantage they have. And they also have the tools to do monitoring of the firm's performance. So what you see when you have commercial banks involved is that they would have the opportunity to sit with management and get inside knowledge about how the firm is going, what the firm's goals are, and doing monitoring of things the firm said they were going to do and see to what extent the firm is actually achieving those goals. On the flip side, banks really don't like long-term fixed loans because that exposes them to risk. So you will see commercial banks usually engaging in shorter-term loans with firms. And if they engage in long-term lendings, what they will do is get into some sort of securitization to lower the risk of exposure to these long-term loans. So commercial banks will be providing many times trade credit for short-term capital, working capital, and will sometimes engage in syndicates helping finance takeovers or leverage buyouts. So the main characteristic of these commercial banks is they can closely monitor the performance of the firm. So the second type of institution are creditors that are non-banks. And amongst these you have credit unions, investment bankers, insurance companies, venture capital companies, government agencies. Oftentimes the instruments provided by these non-banks are slightly different. Just to name a couple, when you're thinking about investment bankers or venture capital companies, if they get in the providing debt, it will always be in the form of a convertible security. So it would not be a pure debt instrument, but it will be a debt instrument that under certain circumstances, it will convert itself into equity, right? So both investment bankers and venture capitalists will have those sort of instruments. What you see in this non-bank side of credit is, as a difference, is basically that, is some convertible or hybrid instruments as opposed to pure debt instruments. And the degree of monitoring and control that these different agents can have varies a lot. So what you have is quite a bit of monitoring and control by investment bankers and venture capitalists, a lot less monitoring and control from government agencies. So the degree of monitoring and control varies a lot across agents in this group. So far we looked at two private sources of credit. The third category is public debt markets. So in public debt markets, can someone tell me how this works? What's the main difference between taking on private debt as opposed to public debt? Anyone? Does prospectus ring a bell as a word? Prospectus? Yeah? What is that? So the way companies get public debt is they go to the markets with a prospectus saying what is it that they want to do with the money they're borrowing, and they will get some sort of intermediation to reach potential investors. So instead of going and talking to just the one bank manager or credit officer, they're going to be talking to the whole market. And two companies going to public markets have to be public companies? Yes, no? Yeah, I'll say it again. Do companies going to get public debt, issuing debt in public markets, do they have to be public? No? No, the answer is no. You don't have to be a public company. You don't have to make an IPO in order to have public debt issues. You have lots of private companies that will issue debt publicly, right? So two different instruments. What you will have to have if you want to go to public markets of debt is the size of the company should be reasonably large. You wouldn't see very small firms going to public markets for debt. But they don't have to be publicly traded at all. So what happens with public debt is that once the instruments are issued, they will have a rating, and that rating will be provided by a credit rating agency. And I'm sure you've seen these from Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and so on and so forth, how you go from a AAA all the way to C and junk bonds. And the debt rating will be provided by one of two ways. You have credit ratings provided that are paid for the company. So I'm paying a credit rating agency to rate my company's debt. But there's also credit ratings that are spontaneously provided by some of these agencies without any request. So when you're looking at these two types of credit ratings, as you know, every time there's a conflict of interest, there's chances that the information in that credit rating is more or less accurate. So always going for debt credit ratings provided by companies that were not paid for by the issuer are the most trustworthy, at least in my opinion. So one last category of credit suppliers is trade credit. This is usually provided by suppliers, and it will take the form of delayed payments by the buyer, right? So you could say, you're going to pay me in the next 30 to 60 days, or 90 days, or 180 days. That is the sort of trade financing that companies have. And you can see trade credit sometimes expressed this way. Can someone tell me what that means? 2/10 net 30? Has anyone seen this before? No? So what that says is you have up to 30 days to pay back, and you will pay the full amount in 30 days. But if you pay within 10 days, you'll get a 2% discount. Right? So those terms are giving you a period to pay, and then a discount if you pay sooner than that. Let's look into a few things of the credit decision. So what we'll cover for pretty much the most of the rest of the lecture is looking at the main concerns for making the credit decision. Then we will analyze some of the areas that lenders look at when making the decision. And we will finalize this part of the lecture looking at the 5 steps that creditors go through when deciding whether they will provide credit or not. So who has to make the credit analysis decision? Well, anyone who's lending money and wants to be repaid. One of the funny things about the credit decision is that it's a binary choice, right? It's a binary outcome kind of scenario, because you do your analysis and you very rarely go, I will lend you less, or I would lend you in any way different. So after the analysis is made, the outcome in most cases is either we're going to lend you the money or we're not going to lend you the money. So it's a 0-1 kind of outcome. And what this brings is 2 types of potential errors when you're making this decision from a creditor's perspective. And those 2 types of errors are what's usually known as type 1 error, which is giving credit to a company that defaults, right? Giving credit to someone you shouldn't have given credit to. Or a type 2 error, which is passing on giving credit to a company that was going to perform well and pay back, right? So out of those 2 errors, which one do you think which one would you feel more comfortable taking out of those 2 risks? Would you rather make a type 1 error or a type 2 error? Hands up if you rather do a type 1 error. Hands up if you would rather make a type 2 error. Yeah. So, and this is what explains that there's more no's than yes out there, right? There's always the risk of not giving money to someone who was going to be performing and paying back. No one will come back to you and say, oh, I remember you had a folder for this customer, you didn't give credit, and blah, blah, blah. Whereas if you made the decision to lend money to a company and that company defaults, it's all going to come down on who made that decision, right? So The nature of the credit market and having this binary outcome and these two types of errors makes it much more common that credit requests will be rejected rather than accepted. There's multiple ways in which financial institutions can recover from the type 1 error, which is securitizing, increasing interest rates, improving monitoring. So there's many ways in which they can lower the type 1 error, but it will remain there. So the error or the risk of making that error will stay there. So this is a very key element to bear in mind when you're thinking about the credit decision making process. So let's quickly shake you up a little bit. Oh. Choo-choo-choo. Come on. Get up there. So it was in a different screen. Now we go. Okay, 5 seconds. Yes, monitoring is the main thing bankers have as an advantage over other lenders. You knew it? Yeah, so there's no collateral on trade credit. Last question. All right, and the winner is... You're too far. Well done.
Thank you very much.
Well done, mate. All right, we'll just go to where we left. Okay, so these are five things that people providing credit will look at in making their decision. Number one, and yeah, mnemotechnic, the idea is to give you a few characteristics there that you can memorize easily with they're all starting with the letter C. So the first one is character. And by character, what they mean is history and experience. And this is something that when you look at financial statements, it's pretty easy to spot. Because what this is all about is not necessarily looking at firms or management who didn't have any problems in the past, but it's more so looking at how they dealt with it. So when you have companies going through tough times, you can either put everything under the rug or expose it, show that you're aware of things going wrong and having a plan to move back to firmer ground. And that is what we mean here by character. When you have management that have been dealing with tough times and they've been transparent and knowing how to deal with the circumstances and having a clear plan, those are things that are highly valued in providing credit to companies. Remember, the number one thing you want to do as someone who lends money is to be repaid. And the number one thing you need to have in order to repay your debts is having the willingness to do it, right? So if you trust the management of the company, that's one really key aspect. And looking at the history of the company gives you a lot of insights about that. The second one is capacity. And this is more so about how diligent management of the company is, how much you trust them, right? So the toughest decision to make is to lend someone money, right? Because it's so easy to not pay and to just walk away and use the money for different purposes. So you definitely have to have a level of confidence in the management of the company. The third C is capital. Do they actually have the financial capacity? And this may sound a little controversial in the sense that if the company is coming to ask you for money, why would you look at whether they have money or not, right? There's this saying that banks usually lend money to those who don't need it, and there's a little bit of that. But by capacity, this may mean capital and capacity. It may mean, do these guys, and this is going to come back with when we look at collateral, if things go wrong, can these guys still repay? Are there things, what are they going to be using the money for? Is this just to cover holes that they cannot cover in any other way? Or is it that they're getting this credit in order to grow? And if things don't go the right way, they still have the capital to repay. What is the condition of the times? Is this a company in an industry that is growing? Are they financing growth prospects? Or are they financing, or are we financing a firm that is in an industry that is in decline and that is not generating cash flows that will be enough to repay the debt? And finally, collateral. And this is directly related to capital, as I said before. So what sort of assets do this company have that if things go wrong, we're going to be able to get our money back? Because remember, once again, number one thing lenders want is to be repaid. Ideally, they're going to be repaid by cash flows generated by the assets. But if things don't go the right way, you at least want to have some assets as collateral that you can dispose of and get your money back, right? So even though it's your plan B as a lender, you definitely need to have one. And collateral is the number one thing financial institutions find as a way of lowering interest rates, right? Because the minute you have collateral, you have collateralized debt, that debt is a lot more secure, and that means repayment is more likely, and therefore interest rates can be lowered. Lenders, as any other investor, will behave or will charge interest rates based on the risk. So anything you can do in the debt instrument to lower the risk will lower the interest rate you are charged. So these are the 5 elements that creditors will look at before lending money. And you have a question for your self-learning tutorial on this week's about the 5 C's. So let's now focus, I'm just going to go back a little bit to show you the 5 steps of the credit decision-making process. So looking at the nature and purpose of the loan, what is it that the loan is going to be used for? What is the type of loan and the security that is going to be available for that loan? What is the potential financial strength of the borrower? Finally, you utilize forecasts to assess the payment prospects. So this is very similar to what we've done when we value a firm, where you have a forecast that you're not necessarily using for valuation purposes, but you use to see whether there's going to be enough cash available at any one point in time to pay interests and repay capital. And finally, the 5th step is, if the loan is approved, put together the documents and the structure of the loan. So let's go through each of those 5 steps. What are the main things that financial institutions or other institutions lending money are looking at? So the main thing is, what is it that the loan is going to be used for? And this has a few levels. One is making sure that what the loan is set to be used for is what they actually are going to use it for, right? Because sometimes, especially when you're dealing with companies that are under some sort of financial stress, there's incentives to go and get money saying, I'm going to be doing A, and then you know that part of that money is actually be used for repaying existing debt. So part of your financial analysis will also, because this is not something that they will tell you, right? They're not going to tell you, oh no, you tricked me. I said I was going to build this project, but in reality, I'm going to use the money to repay these old debts. So the way you can assess whether the company is using the funds for what they're saying they're using it is digging in their financial statements, in their history, in their public communications to make sure that what they say they're building is what they're building, and that there's no hidden things in their financial statements, right? Because if you have a debt that has been rolled over a few times, and you know that the interest rates for the company have been increasing and their credit rating has worsened recently, it is likely that if they're asking for new money, it's just to cover that and not to finance new projects. So that's one side of things. The other one is getting a sense for if this is a legit use of lent funds. What is it that they're going to be using it for? Is it to replace existing financing? Is it to support working capital, so it's short term? Or is it financing long-term investments? And the main reason why you need that is because you will want to match the sort of credit facility you give to your customer to what is it that they need, right? You want to match the instrument you're providing them with so that it's as flexible as they need and as cheap as you can get it so that they can afford it and pay it back. Other things that you will look at is what's the size of the loan? And are you the only creditor lending money? If you're not the only creditor lending money, is there a pecking order in which you're going to be able to get your funds back if things go wrong? What's the seniority of the debt instruments? You will always want to have claims that go first than anyone else, right? So if there's a structure with many lenders, you will want to make sure that you're at the top of that structure. Finally, if there's collateral, who owns the collateral? Sometimes what happens is collateral is an asset, and you go, oh, there's an asset, so I have a claim over the asset, right? But then the question is, does the company own the asset? Or is the asset an off-balance sheet that is sitting on another company that is holding company of this company, right? So sometimes the seniority of those claims will depend on where the collateral is sitting, who actually owns the collateral. So that is something that you would definitely want to look into. And sometimes it's not that evident because you go, oh, it's the building where they operate. But that doesn't mean that that is in their balance sheet. That may be part of a holding company and not theirs. So understanding what is the purpose for the loan is definitely something that you have to be very comfortable about, right? Because if you're lending someone who's going to be using the money for the right reasons, it's more likely that you're going to be repaid. Consider the type of loan and available security. And I just briefly touched on this before. If the company needs financing for working capital, there's no point in giving them a 10-year loan, right? Because if they're financing short-term, they will need to just bridge a gap during the year, and it's more likely that you will give them a line of credit that they can use when they have these financing needs in the short term, and they will only be paying for the money they use instead of giving them a huge cash pile that they will have to pay back in 5 years. If it's long term, you will want to have some sort of collateral like a mortgage, or are we financing mergers and acquisitions? Are we part of a syndicate of banks providing financing to this firm to do a leverage buyout? Completely different situations, right? Completely different uses of money, completely different risk profiles, but definitely you want to understand the type of loan that best suits each of those situations. So why is security important? Well, the moment you have, for instance, secured loans, they're usually associated with lower interest rates, right? So if you have a loan that is secured and there's some collateral behind that loan, that means the lender, the borrower, will have to pay lower interest rates, and that increases the chances of being repaid. So if you can structure your loan in such a way that it makes it more affordable for the company, that is only increasing the bank's chances of getting their money back. So when you're looking at security, this ranking is from more liquid to less liquid assets, and you would expect them to be more effective in terms of lowering the cost of debt. So if the company is sitting on a pile of cash, lending the money is easy because you know that it's very easy to get your money back. If they're sitting on accounts receivable, that is a little bit less liquid. So there's a little bit more time to convert that into cash and being paid back. And as you go down the list, it is a little bit harder to convert that into cash in order to be repaid. There's a little bit of the order in the last two items, machinery and equipment and real estate. The order of those two varies depending on what machinery we're talking about, certainly, because if machinery is very specific to one industry and the company you're lending money to is one of the few companies doing that kind of business, reselling this machinery to get your money back is going to be much tougher than just selling real estate, right? So this is not a fixed list in the sense that this order is the same for all companies, but the whole point of putting that list there is to give you a sense for how more liquid assets give more security to lenders. And there also has to be a match between the security and the loan. So here you have a few different uses of collateral as security for different types of loans. In slide 18, definitely the highlight is the bottom part where you're basically looking at what banks want to try and get is they want to minimize the risk of default, and if default happens, what they want to do is to maximize the chances of getting paid back, even if the company defaults. And this is in the spirit of trying to get paid in all circumstances, under all circumstances. So the third step is looking at the potential of the financial strength of the firm. And this is, when you're looking at this, this is the center of the credit judgment process, which is, is the company going to be able to repay what we are lending them? Do the projects they're saying they're going to be using this money for, are they really profitable? Can they, as a company, deliver these projects, and will they be able to repay? So when you're looking at a short-term loan, you're basically looking at the cash conversion cycle. Can they turn that cash conversion cycle and repay our working capital financing? And when you're looking at long-term loans, you're looking at the long-term profitability of the firm. Is this a firm that is in business in the long run in a profitable way, that year on year, doing what they do, they can get enough profits to repay debt? If the answer is yes, you're going to be a step closer to providing them with credit. We'll continue with point 3 in a second. Let me just ask you a few questions. You can see that, right? Yeah. It's quite a claim. So those are two separate things, right? You got your management on the one side and the actual, yeah. Yeah, because cash is more liquid. Two more questions. Controversial. All right, person on fire. Profitability. Who wins? Yes, this one here. This one. Here you go, this one. Cheers. Congratulations. All right, final sprint for today. All right. So we were looking at how to measure financial strength, and definitely you would look at all the same things we've been looking when we do corporate financial analysis, right? So you will be looking at what is the strategy of the business, what is the past of the company looking like? Is this a strong, financially strong company with growth prospects? Is this a company that is profitable? How is it using the funds? Where is it sourcing the funds from? Can they finance their growth? What is the sustainable growth rate of this company? So one thing you would look at is, for instance, we calculate the sustainable growth rate for this company, and it's a 5% sustainable growth rate. And this is a company that in their prospectus, they're saying that they want to grow at 15% because such and such opportunities have come up like in front of them and they want to take them. So they will be saying there's a portion of this growth that we can take with our own financing, but we definitely need to partner with some financial institutions to make the most out of the growth opportunities. That would be a pitch that sounds reasonable from a potential growth standpoint, saying or hearing from the company, this is how much we can do on our own, and the reason why we need you and your financing is because we have an opportunity to grow more, even more than what we can afford to pay for. Definitely out of the ratios that we looked at in week number 3, is any coverage ratios will be at the center of the analysis from creditors, right? So here we're looking at a coverage ratio, looking at operating cash flow, and whether it's enough to pay for interest, debt repayments, and preferred dividends. Right? So what you would expect is to have a coverage that is greater than 1 and that it has a fair bit of cushioning in there. So to a great extent, the credit rating of companies will depend on how much cushioning there is on the top side over the bottom side of that equation. Right? Higher coverage ratios give more confidence that the company is going to be able to repay, hence better credit ratings and therefore lower interest payments, right? You will also look at cash flow-based measurements. So in the same fashion as we used forecasting to do valuations, you would have a forecast of future performance for the firm, and to see what happens with that future performance when you get the loan we are analyzing in. Will the company be able to repay that, or will it get strangled and not be able to repay? So when you're looking at the long-run funds flow coverage ratio, you would expect it to be greater than 1, obviously. And what you would want to have is that the company is not only being able to repay its debt, but it's also able to maintain its assets, right? So you would want to have some sort of indication that the company can also reinvest in CapEx so that the company can continue to deliver cash flows in the future. This is just another way of expressing your coverage ratios. Key things to have in mind is to make a good assessment of what sort of things can go wrong, right? Many times when companies lend money, it is for a specific purpose, which is we got this new contract and we have to service this contract, right? So what that means is potentially that if that contract goes down, the company will not have the funds to repay. So that would be a really key point to keep in mind when you're lending money to this company, because you know repayment depends upon this one contract the company has. And a company having just the one contract would be riskier than a company asking money to service 15 different contracts, where if one of them drops, they would still have business to continue operating and making it more likely that they will be able to repay debt. So if there's key points that could trigger default, then the next thing to analyze is what are the milestones that we should be checking. And this is definitely something from a bank's perspective. When doing monitoring, you want to have clearly identified what are the things that we need to monitor in order to have an early warning when things are not going right. And the next point to touch on is what sort of corrective measures can we take in order to put the firm back in track. So that is definitely something that you would want to have as a plan when making the decision to lend money to a company. Point number 4, utilize forecasts to assess payment prospects. This is the cash flow forecast that I was mentioning before. When I get the forecast for this company and I put the loan in that forecast, has the company the cash flows to repay debt? Yes, not. Under which circumstances? You're going to be doing your sensitivity analysis, you're going to have your scenarios, looking at what different things may happen to the company and whether the company can still repay under all of those circumstances. So this is very closely related in slide 27 to what we saw in slide 26, in the sense that when you're looking at these financial risks, you're going to be weighing them in this pessimistic scenario and going, well, if everything goes south, how is it going to look like? And next question, is there anything we can do to fix this situation if it happens? So that is part of the planning you have to do ahead before even lending the money. So if, having looked at all the previous 4 steps, the financial institution decides that they're going to lend the money, then they have to put together the loan structure. And one key thing is in there, the covenants in the terms. And by that we mean, what are the things that the companies are going to and are not going to be allowed to do when taking this debt instrument? So that debt covenant, those debt covenants could take many different forms, and here we have a list of them. So maintain a minimum net worth or coverage ratios. So the way that can look is, so the company will have to have a 3.5 times EBIT over interest payments. If the coverage ratio measured as, say, EBIT over interest payments goes below 3.5, something may trigger, right? We either will need to sit and reassess what the interest rate is, or we may need to reassess whether capital is going to be, if this is if the debt instrument is in stages, you could say, I will not release funds after you go below the 3.5 times interests. Because I know that if you go below that point, it's likely that you're not going to be able to repay, so I'd rather stop lending you money, right? So other types of covenants could be having a maximum ratio of total liabilities to net worth. Or it could be, so this is, what this means is, we won't allow you to take on debt past this point, right? Because we judge that as too risky for our liking. An extreme version of that, and I don't know if we have it here, would be the negative pledge, which we touched in that question before, which is, after taking on this debt, you are not taking on any other debt, right? So what that is doing is putting the company in a situation that they know that before taking on any new debt, they will have to repay this existing debt. And from a lender's perspective, is putting a very certain cap on this ratio of total liabilities to net worth. Any other ones that I feel? So these covenants are very typical in M&A and LBO environments, where there's a big chunk of debt financing the takeover, and there's all sorts of limitations on management on what sort of things they can do and cannot do, so that they repay the debt as quickly as possible. Finally, pricing the debt, which most of the time is done using a base rate as prime times or plus X% or this many basis points, or LIBOR plus this, and the plus this is what largely depends on the credit rating. So this is where the credit ratings have an impact on the cost of debt. So the pricing of the debt will have a minimum component, which would be LIBOR or any other base rate, and on top of that is going to be the specific risks associated with lending money to these particular companies. And I will just touch on two more things before we wrap up today. One is the rating agencies, and the other one is distress models. And so this is very commonly seen in public debt, where you have debt ratings that go, say, all the way from AAA to D for the case of Standard & Poor's, and type of ratings vary, but in all cases what you have is a wide spectrum of credit ratings assigned to companies based on how likely they are to repay, right? And the more to the left you go in any of those scales, the more likely companies are to repay, and therefore the lower the interest rates those companies are going to be charged. Right? So that's how the public debt credit rating works. What are the sort of things that are considered when debt ratings are calculated? Well, it's all the things we've been looking at when we do financial analysis. So we're looking at profitability, leverage, interest coverage, cash flow coverage, size of the firm and sales, and level of systematic risk. So when you look at all those components, there's nothing different from what we've been doing when we value a company, right? So one final thing I wanted to touch on is prediction of distress models, and this is basically to touch on something that comes quite frequently in final exams, which is making calculations of Altman's set score. So what Altman did is, this is 1968, I think. So he got a big sample of firms, looking at lots of ratios for those firms, and look at those companies and how they performed over time to try and see if there were one or many ratios that would have some predictive qualities in terms of anticipating which firms will go in distress, financial distress. So, and they came up with a range of values using these 5 components. One is the proportion of total assets that are working capital. The other one is the relationship between retained earnings and assets, which is those retained earnings over assets are showing you a different way of expressing that sustainable growth rate, right? So that is telling you what proportion of your assets are financed by earnings genuinely generated by the firm. Then we have EBIT to total assets, so operating profits. Then looking at the market book of equity to the book value of liabilities. And finally, looking at sales to total assets. So here you have measures of profitability, turnover, reinvestment, growth potential, all combined in the one predictive model. And there's a set of possible outcomes. So the thing with this is that if the lower the score, the worse the company is expected to do. So if the set score for a company is below 1.81, what that is telling us is that the company is likely to go bankrupt within the next 24 months. And between 181 and 267, it's a gray area where companies are in, I would put those companies on the watch list to see how they're trending and to see if they're moving to the left or if they're moving to the right. And if you're over 3 in your Altman set score, what that means is that the company has a very low probability of going bankrupt in the next 24 months. Right? So this is based on accrual basis, so you have to be mindful of that. So this is looking at financial statements, right? So it has its limitations. It's a study made at one point in time using a set of companies at that one point in time. So for outside final exam situations, I will be very careful in using this. I will only use it as a guesstimate kind of tool. But definitely for your final exam, the main thing to understand here is how you calculate this, what the components are, and how to make the decision on whether or should I lend money to this company or not. And clearly when you go 3+, you go like, yeah, I'm happy to lend money to this company. If this is below 1.81, it's probably not a good idea to lend money to this company, right? So having said that, the main way in which you make the decision to either lend money or not to a company would not be this. It would be what we discussed previously, which is looking at all these things, right? Because this, at any one point in time, you can get a good understanding if you do the financial analysis of the company, where the company stands, how is it looking into the future. So I would definitely focus my decision to lend money to a company on this more than on Altman's set score. Having said that, I will ask you the last few questions for today.
The Z-score formula for predicting bankruptcy was published in 1968 by Edward I. Altman, who was, at the time, an assistant professor of finance at New York University. The formula may be used
Very natural voice, isn't it?
that a firm will go into bankruptcy within 2 years. Z-scores are used to predict corporate defaults and an easy-to-calculate control measure for the financial distress status of companies in academic studies. The Z-score uses multiple corporate income and balance sheet values to measure
5
the
seconds.
financial health of a company. Estimation of the formula, the Z-score is a linear combination of 4 or 5 common business ratios
All right.
rated by coefficients.
Coefficients. Long term is only profitability. So it will be a maximum, right? Not a minimum. All right, I'm going to cut it to 20 seconds now. think we got all answers, haven't we? Yep, good. Five seconds. It's not true. Five seconds. All right, let it run this one. Who wins? Yay! All right, I will see you next Friday. Have a good weekend. Huh? No Tim Tams. I ran out of them.